Hello. For the purposes of this video, we're going to be talking about sexual ethics. More specifically, we're going to be talking about sex as a moral issue in and of itself. Now, what I mean by that is that sex as a moral issue in and of itself can sometimes be confused with other issues that have a sexual element to them, but really the morality of whether or not the question of their morality is not related to the sexual element, rather it's related to some other element like an issue of justice or something. For example, the issue of rape. The morality of rape is not determined on the basis of the sexual element of the act. Rather, it's determined on the basis of the fact that rape is a violation of someone's personal rights. It's a violation of their freedom, and it is an egregious injustice. So rape is immoral specifically because it violates a person in their choice and their bodily autonomy, rather than being immoral because it's somehow sexually immoral. The more immorality of it is related to the issue of justice, not the issue of sex. Also the issue of human trafficking is like this as well. Human trafficking is when people are forced into the sex trade. They're forced to be involved somehow in prostitution or maybe production of pornographic films or whatever. They're forced into the sex trade in some way, shape, or form. Now, sometimes that happens through coercion. Sometimes it happens through manipulation. There are many ways. Sometimes it happens as people get a person drug addicted and then force them to be involved in that kind of activity in order to support their habit and so forth. Sex trafficking is a terrible thing that happens in our country today. But the immorality of sex trafficking is more related to the issue of the injustice of it, the manipulation, the exploitation, the violation of a person's personal choice and ability to choose, of their violation of their consent. It's related to those issues more so than it is to issues of a sexual nature. So human trafficking, also female genital mutilation, also known as female circumcision, is another one of these topics that has a sexual element to it. But really the morality of the act or the immorality of the act is determined not on the basis of the sexual nature, but again on the basis of justice. Now, female genital mutilation, if you're not familiar with the practice, what that is that in some cultures around the world, particularly more patriarchal cultures, women at a very young age are taken to have their sexual parts of their anatomy removed or mutilated in such a way so that they are no longer able to achieve a kind of sexual satisfaction. So parts of their anatomy are removed or mutilated so that they cannot enjoy sex later on in life. Now, the reason I mentioned that this is done in some patriarchal societies is because the justification behind it is the cultural notion that if a woman is not able to experience pleasure during sex, then she is less likely to commit adultery and cheat on her husband later on in life. Therefore, she can remain more pure. So that's the idea behind female genital mutilation. And again, the morality of that act is not so much on the sexual element of the act. It is based more so on, or it's derived more so from the issue of injustice. Again, this is done to women without their consent, usually at a very young age, and they're irrevocably scarred afterwards. Another issue where the issue is more of an issue of justice is just prostitution in general. Now, prostitution can be kind of tricky because it may be related to an issue of injustice, but then it could be an issue of sexual morality as well. To give you an example, prostitution is an issue of justice when a woman feels like, or in reality cannot, earn a living in another way. In other words, if she is forced into it, not in a sex trafficking sort of manner, but if she is forced into sex work because she feels that she cannot earn a living any other way. She's tried to provide in every other way that she knows how, and yet this is the only thing that she can do in order to provide a living for herself. Then those might be issues of injustice, maybe of systemic injustice or something of that nature. However, if a woman decides, you know what, I've tried college, I've got my diploma, I really just prefer having sex for a living, and so she chooses to do that on her own free will. She can do it as much as she wants or as little as she wants. She could quit doing it altogether. She's not being coerced or forced by anybody. Then that may be an issue of the nature of the sex act in and of itself, whether it's moral or not. That would be sex as a moral issue, because she is not being constrained by anyone outside of herself or conditions outside of herself to do what she's involved in doing. So that very well could be an issue of sexual morality. So if we're going to be considering sex as a moral issue in and of itself and not issues of justice or things like that right now, what are some variants or types of sexual activity that could be in question when it comes to the morality of sex? Well, there are many different ones that we could name. I'll name a few of them just for the purpose of illustration. I don't necessarily intend to get into all the details of these things, but just to give you a definition or basically of what they are. And then what we'll do is we'll look at a couple of different principles that people have provided or suggested throughout time, and we'll see how each one of those deals with which of these various sex acts it would allow or would permit. So, for example, there's the issue of adultery. Adultery is basically when a person who is married has sex with someone who they're not married to, or a person who is not married has sex with someone who's married to someone else. Basically, adultery is when at least one of the partners is involved in the sex act, is married to someone who is not involved in the sex act. And that's what adultery, technically speaking, is. And then there's the issue of fornication. Fornication is when people who are not married to anyone, neither party is married or any of the parties are married. People when they have sex with someone before they get married, before the marriage covenant. Then there's masturbation, the self-stimulation, when a person basically brings themselves to sexual fulfillment by themselves with no one else involved. There are the issues of oral sex and anal sex. Obviously, these are pretty self-explanatory. Oral sex is the stimulation of sex organs using the mouth. Anal sex, generally speaking, is when someone when people are having sex utilizing the anus instead of other forms of penetration. Homosexuality, sex between people of the same sex. That's what homosexuality is. Polyamory. Polyamory might be a new one to you. I don't know. Poly is a prefix that means many. Amory is a word that means love. And so polyamory is when you have multiple partners who are involved. Now, this could be a polygamous relationship, but it need not be. It could be, people could be having sex with multiple partners outside of marriage as well. Then there's the issue of consensual incest. This is when people who are closely related, either brother or sister or father and daughter, mother, son, whatever any combinations could be, but people are closely related by I believe it's 2 generations or less, who are involved in sexual intercourse. Now, people who are related closely like that cannot get married to one another. That's against the law. That's a question of legality. However, it is quite possible for people who are closely related to be involved sexually in a consensual kind of way. Now, normally we think of incest and we think of somebody forcing somebody into it, maybe an older sibling and a younger sibling, or a parent and a child, or something of that nature, maybe an uncle and a child, a nephew or niece or whatever. But oftentimes, in those cases, incest is more akin to rape, and the issues related to it are more akin to rape. But there are times where siblings could be involved in a consensual act. Cousins could be involved in a consensual act. Now, is that wrong? Now, sometimes the issue of children will be brought into it, but not every sex act is done with the intention of having children. So is it possible that a couple who are closely related could be involved in sex, in a sex act, and it would be morally okay? Is that a morally okay thing to do? The next one would be fetishes. Fetishes are when people are aroused by something that typically isn't thought of as having a sexual component to it. For example, there are some people who have what might be called a foot fetish. And whenever they see feet, it causes them to be aroused. There are others who, might have fetishes over inanimate objects. And whenever they see those inanimate objects, it causes them to be aroused. That's what a fetish is. Is that a moral thing to do? What about BDSM? If you're not familiar with that, an acronym, BDSM stands for Bondage, Discipline, Sadomasochism. And what we're talking about here is the whole 50 Shades of Grey sort of thing, right? People who are into bringing various forms of domination or pain into the sex act. Certainly, if a person was doing this, if it was being done against their will, certainly that would be, again, more akin to a rape situation. However, there are many times where people who are involved with this sort of thing are very consensual to it, and they have various rules and regulations set up around it so as to alert both parties when the act is getting carried away, and that sort of thing. But is BDSM, is that a moral thing to do? What about pedophilia? Pedophilia refers to sexual intimacy or between people who are vastly different in age, between adults and children, typically. Pedophilia is when an adult is sexually attracted to and or aroused by typically prepubescent children. Now, pedophilia, again, is sort of a persuasion, but when a person acts on that persuasion, is that okay? Can we establish a moral sort of pedophilia? That's a question that people are asking today. What about bestiality? The notion that a person is involved in a sex act with an animal of some kind, something that is not a member of the human species. Is that moral? And then necrophilia, a person who's having sex with someone who is deceased. So there's that. And then we'll look at there are other issues that could be discussed that have a sexual element to them that are almost part and parcel with the conversation on sexuality or sexual ethics. And that is sex and marriage. What is the relationship between sex and marriage? Now, historically speaking, and throughout the culture of Western civilization, sex and marriage, it's not as if everybody has always waited to get to have sex before they until they got married before they had sex. However, there are cultural taboos in virtually every culture across the world where sex is typically constrained to the marriage relationship, and that's when something is that prevalent, it seems to almost be embedded in the DNA of human DNA. But what is the relationship between marriage and sex? And then there's the issue of birth control and the ability to put off having children or the bearing of children and that kind of thing. That is related to sexuality as well, because let's face it, sex is the way you have children. It's the way that they're made. That's how they're created. And so what is it moral to have sex without the intention to have children? That's another question that could be asked. Well, there are a lot of topics, as you can see here, that, quite frankly, if we took time to go into each one of them and really kind of survey each one of them and get down to the nuts and bolts and get down to examining all the possible outcomes and this kind of thing, it would take us a long time to evaluate each one of these issues independently. And so really what we need to be in search for is a principle that would govern all of them, and that would give us a working ability to judge them by, to judge whether or not they're acceptable, what do they meet this criteria. And so there are a couple of different views that we're going to look at today that try to do just that. And the first one is this. The first one is the libertarian view of sexual ethics. The libertarian view of sexual ethics. And the libertarian view of sexual ethics says that any sex act is moral as long as it is performed between consenting adults. Any sex act is moral as long as it is performed between consenting adults. Now, this is based off of the libertarian understanding of the principle of non-aggression. To give you a little bit of background, I guess you might have heard of the Libertarian Political Party. The Libertarian Political Party is based on an ideology that is formed around this principle of non-aggression. And the principle of non-aggression is this. It says that a person is free to do whatever they want as long as they do not violate the rights of another person. A person is free to do whatever they want as long as they do not violate the rights of another person. Now, the principle of non-aggression says that we should not violate the rights of another person. And this is sort of in keeping with the libertarian notion, or the liberal notion of the way that we harm somebody fundamentally is by violating their rights. Now, typically we think of harm as being something where somebody might cause us physical injury or pain. But the principle of non-aggression takes it a few steps beyond that. You see, because not all harm is painful, and not all pain is harmful. Harm and pain are not always synonymous. But what constitutes harm, according to the principle of non-aggression, is when we violate the rights of another person. When we violate someone's right, for example, to bodily autonomy, when we violate a person's right to live, when we violate a person's right to freely choose, those kinds of things, those are just as much harmful as if somebody were attacking somebody with a club. They bring harm into the life of the individual upon whom these acts are committed. So in keeping with the principle of non-aggression, the libertarian view says that any sex act is moral as long as it is performed between consenting adults. Now, the reason the term consent is there is because really consenting, if a person has the ability to give consent, then once they have given consent, you're not violating their rights. You're not violating them. You're not bringing harm to them, because nobody's going to consent to someone harming them. Not real harm, not actual harm. So what does it mean to consent? And I think that's the one thing that we need to hone in on, right? That's the definition that we need to make sure that we're 100% on. What does it mean for a person to give their consent, particularly as it relates to the issue of sexuality? Well, there are several conditions that must be met in order for consent to be able to be given from one party to the next. Number one, all parties must be fully informed of the act and the expectations of everyone involved. So there has to be this complete transparency. There has to be a complete awareness and information passed from one person to the next. Everybody needs to be on the same page about what the expectations are of the act. What certain things are okay, what other things are out of bounds. How long, when, where, with whom, what exactly is going to happen, and so forth. So all the details need to be understood by both parties. The expectations, if one person goes into it expecting that this is going to be relationship that they're going to be involved with for the long term, while the other person goes into the act expecting that it'll be a one night sort of fling, then the expectations are not understood by all involved. So there should be a transparency and a communication of all that should be expected by both parties in order for consent to be given. A person cannot give informed consent if they are not informed. There must be no manipulation or coercion of any kind. Coercion refers to the fact that one person is forcing the other through threat of physical violence or actual carrying out of physical violence. Manipulation, though, doesn't have to be so. The coercion doesn't have to be so overt with manipulation. With manipulation, a person could be simply lying to someone in order to tell them what they want to hear, so that they can get permission to go ahead and go through with the act. Somebody saying, "Well, I'm going to love you for the rest of my life." When in fact, in their mind, they have no intention whatsoever of doing that. Well, that's a form of manipulation. Lying to someone is a form of manipulation. And when a person is being manipulated by default, going back to the first principle that we looked at, if a person is manipulating another person, that the person who's being manipulated is not fully informed of the expectations and what to expect at the end of this whole thing. So there cannot be any manipulation. There cannot be any coercion, no threatening, no making a person feel bad or jealous. So why do we go all the way and now we have to stop? Sort of thing. There can be none of that either. Now, number three, or the third principle that we'll look at is this: is just because consent has been extended for one thing, it doesn't mean that it has been granted for everything. So just because a person has given consent to be involved in the sex act, it doesn't mean that they want to do just everything or have everything done to them that could be thought of. Just the consent has been granted. It's been granted for this time, this place, this particular act. And it may not be that the person wants you doing anything else. And so consent, just because it's been extended to you and for one thing, doesn't mean that it's been given for everything. All parties must be possessed of proper faculties in order to give consent. Now, what this means is that there can be no inebriation involved. That there should be no alcohol or nothing that would inhibit the senses. So drugs or alcohol or Special K or whatever, those things should not be involved in. And if they are, then consent hasn't really been properly communicated. Now, here's where it sort of gets a little bit of a sticky situation, because what happens if there are two people are going to get involved in a sexual encounter, and they're both just hammered drunk. And they get involved with the sexual encounter, they wake up the next day, and they're like, "Oh, I didn't mean to do that." Well, who was it then that took advantage of the situation? Who was it then that didn't give or get consent? Well, the correct answer is if they're both drunk, then neither of them can give consent. And so the act has been carried out, but it was not carried out with consent. So all parties really need to be possessed of properly functioning faculties in order to have the ability to give consent to one another. Otherwise, they can't do it. Right? Consent can be withdrawn at any time during the act. Consent can be withdrawn at any time during the act. If you're halfway through and all of a sudden one person gets cold feet, they have the perfect right to say, "Stop what we're doing. I don't want to go any further." And just because consent was granted earlier doesn't mean that it's granted until you get a sort of a blank check for the rest of the encounter, however long that may be. Either party can cut it off at any time that they want to by withdrawing their consent and saying, "No, we need to not do this." So that there it is. The libertarian view of sexual ethics is pretty self-explanatory. It's pretty straightforward. Any sex act is moral as long as it is performed between consenting adults. One last thing on that, though, has to do with the idea of adults there. Now, why does it have to be adults? Why do people have to be adults involved in this situation? Why can't it just be two consenting parties? And certainly there are those out there who will argue for that, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But at the end of the day, the libertarian view of sexual ethics includes the notion of adults because it assumes that a child does not have the ability to grant consent. Because a child, number one, their physiology is not fully formed, and not only their body parts, their sexual body parts, but also their mind, their ability to understand consequences, their ability to consider future implications of their present behavior. Those things are not fully formed, and they're not fully functioning, not until they become an adult. Now, there's no really magic age at which these things take place. It's going to vary from one individual to the next. However, by a general rule of thumb, if a child cannot give consent in order to be involved in sexual acts, so that's why the issue of consenting adults is brought up there. All right, so let's take a look at some of those issues that we looked at earlier. And let's see and ask the question, which of these acts or which of these activities would be out of bounds if the libertarian view of sexual ethics was the view that we espoused? Just look down through them for just a moment. Adultery, fornication, masturbation, oral or anal sex, homosexuality, polyamory, consensual incest, fetishes, BDSM, pedophilia, bestiality, necrophilia. Which of these activities, which of these would be, let's say, out of bounds? Well, if you look at it, certainly some of the ones that immediately jump out would be pedophilia. That would be out of bounds because it's not between consenting adults. Again, it specifically states that children cannot give consent, and therefore sexual acts between adults and children are non-consensual by definition. What about bestiality? Now, an animal cannot give consent. It doesn't have the ability to do so. So consent, so that would be an immoral thing. Necrophilia would be an immoral thing, a person having sex with a deceased person, with the only possible exception if that might make an allowance for that is if the person who is deceased gave their permission prior to dying for the person who is performing the act upon them. That would be a possible exception. Consensual incest. So long as both parties are of age and adults, then the libertarian view of sexual ethics would be perfectly okay with that, I think. Polyamory, same thing. As long as it's consensual, then polyamory would be fine. Homosexuality, again, so long as it's consensual, that would be considered within the bounds. Oral and anal sex, as long as it's consensual, both of those. Masturbation would be fine. Fornication would be fine, so long as they're adults and consent is given. Adultery. Now this one presents a bit of a problem. Adultery. Would adultery be out of bounds according to the principle of libertarian sexual ethics? Well, while the two people who are involved in the sex act may very well be giving their consent to one another, there still is a third party who's somewhat involved here, isn't there? A third party whose rights are being violated. Because when people enter into a marriage agreement, a contract, they do so fully expecting that they have certain rights and privileges, sexually speaking, with one another. And so when a person is committing adultery, then they are violating the rights of their marriage partner. They're violating the rights and the privileges, the expectations that they agreed to extend to them when they said their vows. And so according to the libertarian view of sexual ethics, adultery would actually be immoral because of that person's rights being violated. Alrighty, well, that's the libertarian view of sexual ethics, and honestly, it's probably the one that's most prevalent today. As you walk around and talk to people about issues like this, it's almost as if they assume that this is the self-evident rule of thumb that guides all of our sexual activities. However, it's not the only one, and it certainly isn't the oldest one either. The libertarian view of sexual ethics actually is a rather new and novel view. Not that it hasn't been around for a while, but it's certainly been one that has not gained in popularity until maybe the 60s, the 1960s or so, with the sexual revolution. Maybe a little bit earlier in some circles before that. But prior to that, in Western civilization anyway, prior to that, the dominant view of sexual ethics that was most popular during those times, or what we might know today as the traditional view of sexual ethics. The traditional view of sexual ethics. Now, the traditional view of sexual ethics says that sex is only permissible between two people in a lawful marriage relationship. Sex is only permissible between two people. Sex is only permissible between two people in a lawful marriage relationship. Now, with this particular definition, we start bringing in some concepts that are outside of the sexual act itself. Some considerations that would serve to guide us that are not necessarily involved in the sex act itself. For example, the concept of marriage. The concept of marriage. Now, what is marriage? That really is a great question in our culture today, because the traditional mores and views of marriage have shifted much within our lifetime. What it means to be married and the prominence of married life and of marriage in general in civilization is something that has been really challenged in our day. But this view, the traditional view, we will seek to define what marriage is. Now, what is marriage? Well, according to the traditional view of sexual ethics, a traditional marriage is this. It's a legally binding, public solemnized relationship between a husband and a wife that forms the basis for the raising of children. It's a legally binding, publicly solemnized relationship between a husband and wife that forms the basis for raising children. Now, I do want to break this definition down a little bit and just give a little bit of an explanation about various elements within it. But the idea here is that marriage is something that is there to accomplish an end. It has a purpose. And if we're going to be talking about the traditional view of sexual ethics, then we have to understand that the traditional view of marriage is the one that it has in view as well. And so here a few years back, with the Supreme Court decision of Obergefell versus Hodges, in the United States, marriage laws and basically the common understanding of what constitutes marriage that had been in place for millennia before really was challenged with the legalization of same-sex marriage relationships. Now, so when the traditional view of marriage or the traditional view of sexual ethics talks about a marriage, understand that we're talking about a marriage prior to that sort of reimagining of what constitutes marriage. In other words, marriage, according to the traditional view of sexual ethics, has a lot to do about the procreation or procreational activities of men and women. Marriage was about bearing children. Marriage was about passing on cultural heritage from one generation to the next. In some cases, marriage was about passing on one's inherited title to the next generation. So marriage was a thing that was looked upon specifically and was geared specifically around the raising and rearing of children. And the idea that is espoused by traditional sexual ethics in traditional marriage is that children are better cared for and have the best advantage in life when raised by a father and mother who are committed to one another and to them. The children are better cared for and have the best advantage in life when raised by a father and mother who are committed to one another and to them. Now, when the traditional view of marriage says that children are better cared for from within the context of a marriage relationship, this is not necessarily a dig on single-parent households, on blended families, or anything like that. Basically, what they're saying is, look, if everything else is equal, and this is the only factor that we have to go on, then a family where you have both mom and dad and you have with the children is going to most of the time be better off than a family who doesn't have one or the other of the parents. Now, people could get up in arms about that, and they could point out situations where that's certainly not the case. Maybe abusive households where parents are abusive and everything. But if we're talking about equal, everything else is equal. Like the only thing that really divides them up is that one has both parents, the other has only one. In general terms, the traditional view of sexual ethics would say, yeah, that's where children are going to do the best at, when they have that nurturing environment of both parents in the house in order to raise them. Now comes the question, though, why not? Why marriage? Why marriage? Why do we have to do marriage? Why not just have people who love one another? They can move in together. They can start a family on their own. The only thing that we're missing is a piece of paper and this sort of thing. Why not just go and do things that way? Well, there's something to be said for the public solemnization of one's marriage vows. Something to be said is that it's a formal statement of commitment. Now, you have to ask yourself, if your significant other will not agree to marry you, then why not? If they say they're committed to you and they won't get married, they refuse to make that marriage covenant legal and binding, then you have reason to disbelieve them in their pledge of commitment to you. You have a reason to doubt if they are actually really committed to you. So while the piece of paper may seem to be very little in the grand scheme of things, well, you have to ask yourself, why won't they sign the piece of paper? Why won't they make that extra little pledge of commitment? Are they truly committed to you or not? Why not fornication? Why not sleeping together before marriage? Why not just living together and raising a family on that basis? Not only does fornication lack the ultimate pledge of commitment, but fornication also sort of undermines the role that marriage plays in the cohesion of society. You see, because marriage focuses, in the view of traditional sexual ethics, marriage focuses the sexual energy into productivity. For example, men in particular have this sexual overdrive. And if they aren't married, if they don't have a regular source of fulfillment of that sexual energy, well, then they're going to spend all their time trying to find that. And so they're going to go from one partner to the next, and they're going to waste a lot of time and a lot of energy that could be spent on doing something more productive. However, when they are in a marriage relationship where there's a regular fulfillment of that sexual need, those sexual desires, then a man will be able to focus his energy on other areas. And furthermore, when a family comes along, when children start coming along, men tend to even become more productive. And so, for example, if a man is going to work and all of a sudden a child comes along, he's more likely to become more productive in himself in order to provide for the family and make sure the needs of the family are met, make sure the security is there for them. And so that's what he goes and he does. And that ramps up productivity. Now, if you do that society-wide, then that benefits all of society, because instead of looking around for the next fulfillment of their sexual desires, the sexual energy of men can be then focused into productivity in society, and that can develop economy, that can develop in industry, that can develop all kinds of opportunities. So marriage tends to have that sort of effect on men in particular. Sexual marriage marriage benefits the husband in the ways that we've previously talked about. Marriage traditionally has benefited the wife as well, because if her husband is committed to her, then she has sort of a shelter. She is the nurturer in the family. She is the one that nurtures her child and raises her child, and she can do that better within a context where she doesn't have to go then and seek for a living for herself. She can focus her time and energy on the nurturing of the next generation, and that's the kind of scenario that traditional view of sexual ethics envisions, the traditional nuclear family, where the husband is the primary breadwinner for the house, and the wife is the primary nurturer of the children and helps raising the children and that sort of thing. So that's the kind of family unit that is envisioned here in traditional sexual ethics. But those are two different views. Now think about then on the traditional view of sexual ethics, that is going to be a different approach than the libertarian view, clearly. But think about back to our panoply, if you will, of sexual activities. Think about what this particular principle would make outlaw or out of bounds. Certainly, adultery would be out of bounds on the basis of the traditional view of sexual ethics, because sexual exclusivity is presupposed with the marriage covenant. Fornication would likewise be that, because in a situation where people are having sex outside of marriage, they would not be prepared to have or raise children. Oral and anal sex, some people would say that these are sort of innocuous as long as they're performed by a married couple. That would be fine. Others would take the view, though, within the traditional view of sexual ethics. Others would say, well, because oral sex does not eventuate in an activity that is where it's possible to have children, nor does anal sex, then those varieties of sexual intercourse would not be moral. Those would be immoral to the extent that they were not intended to lead to procreation. Homosexuality, certainly according to this view, would not be permissible, because homosexual unions in and of themselves are innately, inherently sterile. They cannot have children. They cannot result in children. Polyamory, the multiple lovers. Interestingly enough, if polyamory resulted in polygamy, then it's possible for that to be moral. If polyamory were to result in polygamy. Now, what polygamy is that polygamy is when a person has when a man traditionally has many wives. And the way that a traditional polygamous relationship works is that the man has a marriage covenant or contract with each one of his wives. However, the wives do not have a marriage contract with each other. So the man is married to, let's say, 3 wives. But the wives of that man are not married to one another. So the sexual activity is purely heterosexual. The man is having sex with his wives, but the women are not sexually involved with one another in a polyamorous relation, or a polygamous rather relationship. Now, because of the sort of ever-shifting sands of the modern view of marriage, now polygamists are involved in scenarios where the husband is married to the wife, who's married to the other wife, who's married also to the husband, and this sort of thing. But in the traditional view of marriage, in the traditional view of sexual ethics, would not necessarily exclude polygamous relationships if they are purely a heterosexual arrangement, because the husband can then go on to have relations with his wives, and then they can raise children in that way as well. So it wouldn't necessarily exclude those. Consensual incest. Well, this is a sort of a tricky one, because there have been cases that they're rare, but they have happened, where brothers and sisters are separated early on and adopted to different families, who then later on go and find one another, who end up dating or getting married and having children together, and they don't know about it, right? Now, would that be moral or immoral? On the view of traditional sexual ethics? Well, I think on taking this view into consideration, at first it would probably be moral. However, only in so much as a person did not know. They were ignorant of the fact that this person with whom they are procreating is their close relative. Because if you knew that going into it, then if the intent was to have children with this person, well, you got to understand that genetically speaking, there could be some serious problems related to incestuous relationships where people are fathering and mothering, who are bearing children with close relatives. So as long as the couple is ignorant about it, then it wouldn't be an immoral thing. Once the couple became aware of the fact, then perhaps it would perhaps be immoral at that time. You might ask, well, what if they decided to get sterilized and didn't have children? Well, again, that goes against the traditional view of sexual ethics because sexual activities are innately for the purpose of bearing children, for raising a family. What about fetishes? Fetishes would be considered a sort of aberration. I don't know that they would be immoral as long as they were not carried out on people outside of the marriage covenant. BDSM, interestingly enough, BDSM, so long as it has an end purpose of procreation, then it's possible that the traditional view would not specifically outlaw BDSM between married partners. So that's a possibility. Pedophilia. Clearly, this would not be permitted within a traditional view of sexual ethics because, again, marriage is presuming that you're going to procreate, and you cannot procreate with a prepubescent child. So that would be out of bounds. Necrophilia. Necrophilia would be absolutely immoral. You're not going to be able to procreate with a corpse, and so forth. So those would be out of bounds as well. Well, that is the view of traditional sexual ethics and kind of how it would respond to some of those things. Clearly, there are issues that people will take with both the libertarian view and the traditional view of sexual ethics, but it is interesting to consider. Well, make sure that you check the syllabus, make sure you get your reading done, and take the quizzes and whatever other work is there assigned for this particular module. And we'll see you in the next video. Have a great week.